All right, technology is working now. Good morning. It's an honor to be here. Council members, council president, members of the public, thank you so much. Just by way of introduction, let me say that I had the honor of being recruited to come to the city of Oakland a little over 6 years ago to stand up its first Department of Race and Equity. And we've made tremendous progress in this work. And the thing about what we're doing here in the city of Oakland in following the ordinance that was passed by the city council is to stand up a very structured approach to instigating transformational institutional change in the direction of pro-equity, advancing equity in our communities who've been marginalized by systemic and institutional racism. So this is not the way that we always talk about these problems. It is it's a different approach, not as new as it was 15, 16 years ago when we started putting it together in Seattle, Washington, but it is nonetheless a very particular way of thinking about changing the outcomes so that we're experiencing eventually something different and much, much better than our current conditions for BIPOC communities in Oakland and elsewhere in the country where this methodology has been taken up. So what I'm going to do for you today or with you today, because I think it's the best place for us to begin, is present some sample slides that are from the Academy, the Advancing Racial Equity Academy, and then NEO, New Employee Orientation, that we use to introduce staff to this work and to frame up how we do it and why we do it and what the assumptions and thinking behind it are that make it more effective or that strive to make it more effective and in fact have proved to be very productive in advancing equity. So these slides are not new slides. I don't think there's a new slide in the deck. They've been used a lot, and what I say about them is going to be very consistent this morning to what I say to other city staff when I'm working with them to prepare them to join an equity team in their department, or whether it's to just expand their thinking around embedding equity in their day-to-day work. That's our goal. So next slide, please. We always begin by acknowledging that we are on the unceded land of the Ohlone people, that we abhor the atrocities that were perpetuated on indigenous tribes in the state of California, and that we know that this acknowledgement is not sufficient, that it will take much, much more intentional work, rebuilding relationships and cultivating shared agendas with our indigenous people, and who are very much present and very much actively working for their own liberation and the restoration of land and opportunity to indigenous people. And so we honor the work of their ancestors, or the lives of their ancestors that preserved this land, and the lives of their descendants who are still here fighting for rights and justice with us here in the city of Oakland. Next slide, please. We want to begin with vision. It's important to have vision when you're doing this work because this is very difficult work. The idea of addressing and dismantling systemic and structural racism is not for the faint of heart. It is very hard to look at it head on, on the regular, if you will. And so we need to have a vision that will sustain us and inspire us. So our vision is big. Well, I should minimize this. I'm so sorry. I don't know if that's there. My screen was looking funny. The vision is a big vision, and we know it's big because that's what inspires human beings to reach beyond their current capacity and even ability in some cases. So our vision is to maintain Oakland's diversity and to create a city where racial disparities have been eliminated and racial equity has been achieved. And in fact, we will know that racial equity has been achieved when our residents' life outcomes are not predictable by race or zip code, or we often use geography as a stand-in. So we will be able to know when we get there, and we know that we're not there and we're quite a good way away from being there. And we are willing to stand in that tension here in the city of Oakland because we made that commitment. We begin with some high-level goals to get us started and to think about what should we be focusing on. The first is our ability to identify and eliminate systemic causes of racial disparities that are embedded in city government. And it makes sense for us to start there because we are city government, we're on the inside of it, and we have the opportunity to change it from the inside out. But it does take some refinement of our lens, if you will, to be able to see what they look like, because of course, this many years post civil rights changes in the law are the ways in which inequity is embedded in our systems is no longer clearly articulated. It is in colorblind policies that appear to be neutral, but that don't have a neutral impact. And that's why we always focus on impacts and not just intentions, because we want to know how what we are doing impacts our communities. We have to promote inclusion and full participation for all residents of the city. This is essential because without us being intentional about that, the playing field is very unlevel, and we do not hear the voices of those who are most marginalized and have been most marginalized for hundreds of years now in this country. So we have to actually promote inclusion of those who have been disenfranchised through one methodology or multiple methodologies over time in our country. And then the last thing is we're beginning to learn about how do we be intentional about reducing those race-based disparities in our communities. In other words, what outcome do we want instead of those outcomes? And how do we work backwards to achieve it? And then how do we measure our progress going into the future as to achieving those reductions? So this is all learning. None of this is built into city government historically, or any institutional structures in our country historically. It is the relearning of how we think about getting to a better place. Not that others haven't tried, and there have always been people pushing for justice, always. This is not brand new in that way. It's just a slightly different methodology. Next slide, please. One of the things we want to acknowledge from the very beginning is that equity and justice is not the same as diversity and inclusion. And there's a very popular movement right now to rebrand diversity efforts in various institutions as DEI. Just put equity in the middle and then everything is good. That only works to make a difference if you know what the difference, or acknowledge and operate according to the differences between diversity, inclusion, and equity. Doesn't mean that diversity and inclusion were wasted. We needed to create greater diversity in rooms where decisions are made, and in the workplace in general, in many, many areas, in order to be able to talk about inclusion, which then got us a little bit more comfortable with talking about what are the experiences of different identities in our institutions and in our society, which did help prepare us to actually look at the policies, practices, and procedures for change in order to ensure equitable outcomes. So if you come in and you're included in the process, but the process is still churning out racial disparities, we haven't fixed the problem yet. So now we have matured to a place where we can put the institution itself on the table, not just the individuals within it, but what the institution and institutions do that perpetuate injustice is now the focus of equity and justice work. Next slide, please. We also have to be very clear about what we're talking about, because vocabulary is different in different realms, and if we're not speaking the same language, and since our society actually doesn't have a whole lot of shared equity vision historically, we have to develop a vocabulary and an understanding of exactly what it is we're trying to do. Obviously, this graphic has been very popular. It's on its multiple iterations. This is the version I'm using now. It's not the version I started with 15 years ago. But you can see that when we just focus on treating everyone the same or equality, we do not get equitable outcomes, because equity means everyone actually has access and actually has the opportunity to achieve their full potential. And we know that that's not true in our society now, because we know what the outcomes are. If everyone actually had opportunity to achieve their true potential, there would certainly be differences in people's life outcomes for many variable reasons, but those differences would not be predictable by race. They wouldn't be predictable by gender. They would not be predictable by these social identities that have attached to them a construct that causes certain groups of people to have very different starting lines today. They've had different starting lines throughout the history of this country, because of various constructs that have been in place around these different groups of people that have created barriers to opportunity. So equity has this specific definition. Would you click again, please? Yeah, go ahead and finish that slide out. Thank you. That it's about just and fair inclusion, explicitly including those from whom justice has been withheld. Another way of saying that, those who've been impacted by racial disparities. An equitable society is one in which all actually can participate in and prosper, not just aspirationally, but where we have clear evidence that people have been supported or lifted with the right supports that enable them to be on the level, if you will, with those who have not been held back historically in this country. The goals of equity must be to create conditions that allow each and all to reach their full potential. And everyone's full potential is different, but it's about removing those barriers to opportunity and increasing access to opportunity, that we can eventually create a place where we actually have a true meritocracy because everyone is starting on the same starting line. Equity requires system change. So we can't do this without actually changing systems. And the fence in this graphic is what represents institutions and their barriers and their boundaries. Fences don't build and maintain themselves. They're not designed and structured spontaneously. They are actually invented and created and maintained by the people who run those institutions, by those of us that work inside the fence, not outside the fence, but over there in the luxury box at the gate, deciding who gets to come in and out, etc. We also build this fence out of a myriad of policies, practices, and procedures. And that's what those boards represent. Think of them as different areas maybe of the city. And each of those areas has different mechanisms built into them that work better for some groups of people than they do for others. And that's all it takes to create inequity. If your system works for some and does not work for all, you will perpetuate and reinscribe racial inequities, gender inequities, et cetera. So this is a complete shift about how we think about the institution, that all institutions in this country are predisposed, heavily predisposed to not be designed to serve all equitably. So we have to redesign them. So the fence is one of our focuses, so we can focus on the supports and the boxes that you see under these people that level things up, but we can also focus on the fence. Imagine if the fence were chain link. And this is a good point to bring in, a good place to bring in targeted universalism. If the fence was chain link, it would disproportionately benefit the persons on the left who can't see over it so easily. But it would also benefit the person who can see over it. They would be able to see what's going on and access opportunity without standing at the fence. They'd be able to sit on the ground, spread a blanket, have a picnic. It would be more accessible for everyone, but it would level up and make that accessibility available to all. And that's our goal with targeted universalism and changing institutions so that they work for everyone and not just some. Next slide, please. We use working assumptions to help frame up our work. Yes, you can put them all up. Thank you, because I'm going to move quickly through them. These working assumptions help us think outside of the racialized box that we were all socialized into. It's not easy for our brains. We have plenty of plasticity in order to achieve that, plenty of flexibility in our brain. But so much of what the box is made of is unconscious. We absorbed it throughout our lifetimes along the way, and it created what our perspectives are about race. And so we came by our box honestly. It was handed to us. It's a legacy. And but part of our task is to help city staff and others that we have a chance to work with to think outside of that box, because that which we were given will continue to create the same outcomes. And we all are in agreement that that's inconsistent with our vision. And therefore, we have to find a different package of thinking, tools, approaches, et cetera. So these assumptions are that race matters because we have many indicators that show troubling disparities that are predictable by race. We know now, because we have the backward look of looking at the history of this country, that these disparities have been created and maintained historically, not so inadvertently, but now largely without effort, through policies and practices that do, in fact, contain barriers to opportunity. Systemic racism. It's possible and only possible to close equity gaps by using strategies that are determined through some intentional focus on race. We don't have to only focus on race, but if race is part of the cause of the disparities, we must address the ways in which race is working around those disparities if we hope to get to the other side. If opportunities in all key areas of well-being are equitable, then equitable results will follow. This is a logic statement that harkens back to that we're taking our outcomes and working backwards from them. We now understand much more deeply what caused those inequities. So if we can reverse the barriers to opportunities, if we can increase the access for those who've been marginalized, then equitable results will follow. It will take us a while to do that because these inequities in policy practices and procedures are so deeply embedded, and sadly not just in the city of Oakland, but across our society. So this is a collective effort, and this conversation is going on in many places, not just cities, counties, and states, but also it's beginning to happen in private sector as well. So given the right message, analysis, and tools, people will work toward racial equity. That's the mission right there of the Department of Race and Equity in a nutshell. My attribution isn't showing here. These assumptions were developed by the Annie E. Casey Foundation in their Race Matters toolkit. And they did really good work on this to make these words communicate the essence of what this work looks like or focuses on or assumes going in. And the Department of Race and Equity was established to bring in the right message, analysis, and tools so that more people in the city of Oakland, more staff in the city of Oakland specifically, would be enabled to work toward racial equity. Next slide, please. So it's important that as we just keep deepening our thinking. This is always, my thinking around systemic and institutionalized racism continues to expand the more experience I have with trying to address it. And that will be true for all of us that jump in the water and get involved in this work. But succinctly put, systemic and institutionalized racism is a pattern of social institutions such as governmental organizations, schools, banks, and courts of law, perpetuating negative treatment toward a group of people based on their race. Institutional racism leads to inequity in opportunity and inequity in inequality in opportunity and inequity in life outcomes. Now, you can see here that I immediately went down into racism. That's one of the isms that is a systemic issue. So if anything has an ism on the end of it, we're talking not just about how an individual experiences the society, but also about how the society treats those individuals in that group. So you could substitute gender here. You could say negative treatment toward a group of people based on gender, and that institutional sexism leads to inequality in opportunity and inequity in life outcomes. The reason we start with racism is because racism comes in on top of all those other isms and actually creates another layer of inequity. So to be a woman is to be subjected to sexism and have barriers and inequality in access to opportunity. But if you are a woman of color, you also experience intersectionality of gender and race. So in order to really treat gender issues, we must also be conversant with race. So we start with race so that we can then do the intersectionality work of looking at other isms in our realm. So it's not exclusive of those other identities and isms. It is just the place we start so that we will be prepared to disaggregate gender data and so on to look at the different layers of impact within sexism, just as an example. Next slide, please. So we know that systemic racism is an unacceptable aspect of our culture. Most of us certainly here on the left coast can agree to that. It has deep roots, but that does not mean that it cannot be examined, recognized, and addressed. But we do believe that if we always do what we've always done, we will always get what we've always got. And this is just proof that, people can be better than the worst thing they ever did. Henry Ford's no longer the hero that he used to be because we know some more of his history, but he did get this right. And it is also a simple logic statement in many, many ways. Next slide, please. So in order to actually take this to that systemic transformational level, we have to have a theory of change that includes the elements, the levers that facilitate or accelerate organizational change. Organizational change is not easy to achieve. System change experts estimate that less than 50% of change efforts are successful in this country. All change efforts, so things that we might think are simpler than changing a system around race. So in order to not waste too much of our energy on this talk that we have to do, we do have to talk. We want to be supported with a theory of change that addresses the levers of organizational change that work. So first of all, we have to be willing to make a compelling case for racial equity. And all of us in the city should be able to, After we practice a bit, maybe get a little technical assistance and training, we should all be able to make a compelling case for racial equity. It's not very complicated. It just means paying attention to some different ideas and data points than we normally pay attention to. And then we're working on preparing advocates and leadership to advance equity. So that's the training and capacity building we do. We're working on building infrastructure and political will to support the change. So we've begun to put, administrative instructions and city council report templates. And in other places, we're gradually embedding prompts in our work that will help us move this, socialize this work into normal behavior, typical behavior, just what we do here. We're practicing applying new skills using things like racial equity impact analysis and inclusive outreach and engagement principles. We're action focused on changes to policies, procedures, and practices. It's not just aspirational, theoretical, and something we long for, maybe with our heart of hearts. It is actually about action, policies, practices, and procedures. We are also starting to gear up. This is a harder thing, I think, particularly in cities like Oakland that don't have as much capacity in certain technical areas, but we are working on measuring progress and recognizing accomplishments. We want to recognize accomplishments that are actually backed up by progress. And when we talk about progress, we want to be able to prove that progress. So meaningfully measuring our work and measuring our impacts. We all know how cities and government in general struggles with metrics. And so now this is another layer on top of the usual struggle that says, and we also want to measure how equitably we are serving our community and how equitably we are operating as an institution. So that's also part of this change process because it's not currently completely built out. Next slide. So we have some very particular ways that we go about building skills, and I've already alluded to some of them. And that is that, first of all, one of our very earliest actions was to stand up the city administrator's office. Before I was even hired, sent out an instruction to the departments to please convene an equity team in their department. And these teams are basically work groups. They're equity work groups embedded in departments, trained and supported technically by the Department of Race and Equity, now that we have one. And so we provide their training through the academy. That is, you can see a graphic for that's an old flyer up in the upper right-hand corner for the academy. It's a three-part series. We now have added it's a 4-part series, and we've now added 2 additional modules that are optional. They're not part of the basic series, but they're supplemental. So in addition to these 4 modules, we do specific models on result-based accountability and racial equity impact analysis. We stood up an equity indicator report to help us get more familiar and conscious about measurements and looking at disparities that are present in our city. And we're in the process of updating that right now. We did stand up an administrative instruction about all of this work about 2 years ago. So these are just examples of some of the pieces of activity that the Department of Race and Equity keeps going in order to build skills and infrastructure that will be necessary in order for people to work for racial equity and justice in the city of Oakland. Next slide, please. That's work is supported by now 4 of us. I need a new staff picture, but we just brought on a 4th person who is another technical person to help us with that technical support to departments and in order to help them move the work forward, to support the training. It just keeps growing. I'm the primary trainer. I've been a trainer in this work for the entire 15, 16 years I've been in it. So I've got the most experience on staff, but we're going to be able to train someone else up to take some of that burden. Very important because I am I've got the director duties too, which are the ones I tend to not attend to sometimes because the need to keep this work rolling is imperative in order to not lose momentum and in order to build to the tipping point of change that we're going for. So we have some specific tools we train to, the implementation guide. The equity implementation guide is basically the analysis, the inclusive outreach and engagement planning guide, and then our coaching and technical assistance. And that's our crew. You see there, Ayana Allen and Jackie Lorenz are with me. Next slide, please. So we have some applied work products, some equity products that we're very proud of. This is just a sampler. So our earliest and first was, of course, the Cannabis Equity Program. And that was popping off right as I was getting here in 2016. And so I got to dive right into it with the key staff, Greg Miner. And this has become a national model. It's been borrowed from, it's probably been improved upon, I hope, as it swept across the country, that there was some serious equity work to be done around the legalization of cannabis. So this program has continued to grow also. And that's the thing we need to understand about our equity work is our first effort in any particular area can be better than what we're currently doing and still be improved. And so we want to create an environment of continuous learning, praxis, of trying things, looking at their impacts, and then plowing that learning back into the programs and improving them going forward. It has also helped that this program attracted a lot of state resources into the city of Oakland when the state stood up their cannabis equity program, because we were out ahead and were prepared to work with the state in accessing some grants that they set up to support cannabis equity programs across the state. So equity is the best model in so many ways, including that it sets us up to compete very well for resources, because our approach is to be very specific and very intentional about outcomes and measurements and those sorts of things. Generally speaking, even if someone's not deeply into doing equity work, they tend to like the approach that equity theory and approach sets up, because it's more tangible, it's more intentional, and that is attractive to grant makers. So the downtown plan got equity embedded in it. I should update this slide, because the general plan is now even more guided by equity principles and approaches, and in some ways is bigger because it overarches the downtown plan and will impact the whole city. That process is well underway with the equity elements built into it. Of course, our capital improvement plan has been studied across the country because we are the first city that we know of anyway that has built a meaningful approach, a very intentional approach into developing capital improvement programs in an equitable way, in a space that has historically in most cities been pretty random, and random processes do not produce equity because there's too much inequity built into everything around us and everything in our environment. So if we want to interrupt that, we have to have a specific way of doing it, and the capital improvement plan is that. Like Oakland picked up equity threads early on. Another thing I got to talk to folks about when I first got here, because it was being created then. And then, of course, our equitable climate action plan is the envy of the country. It's gotten federal attention. It's gotten state attention. It probably is a poster child of how to do it and how it looks when you really take an intentional, planned approach and put resources into it and that sort of thing. So it's going to be a very important guide for the city for the next 20 years. Next slide. So this is a little bit more information about the CIP. I'm not going to actually go into it. This is really in the weeds, but just know that if you want to understand it more, the capital improvement plan is supported by a capital improvement work group, and they do presentations about how it works and what the factors are and how they embed our shared values for equity in our CIP process. So I just wanted to represent that. Lots of very intentional work has gone into this. Next slide. Next slide. That's more on the other. There are some results that we can show. This is our capital improvement program projects, the projects that were in queue prior to implementing the capital improvement plan process that we're using now, which includes a whole section of making sure that communities where the map doesn't have dots, that we fix that over time. And this is what it looks like 2 short cycles later. So you can see here equity work in action and equity work having impact that provides much more equity and justice in our approach to spending capital dollars in the city of Oakland. This is just amazing. People are just amazed that this was able to happen in the amount of time that it did. Next slide. So that's the end of the formal presentation. There's a lot more on our website. Of course, I'm always available to do a meet and greet or a deeper dive on with individuals about the things that they're interested in, or questions that may come up as you go. But are there any questions or reflections for me today? I'm going to stop talking now.